Welcome to this week's edition of Journalists Roundtable. I'm Francine Schertzer. My guests this week are Kim Lyons, editor of the Pennsylvania Capital Star, Todd Shepherd, chief investigative reporter with Broad and Liberty, and Katie Meyer, government editor reporter with Spotlight PA. Katie, we'll start with you. Governor Josh Shapiro is expected to make his second budget address next week. Can you talk briefly about some of his early accomplishments from last year and what you expect to see in this coming budget?
Sure. Well, I think a lot of the first year for Shapiro was taken up with budget negotiations, trying to thread the needle between himself, his own priorities, the Democratic-controlled House, and the Republican-controlled Senate. And so, I think probably he would consider this a compromise or an accomplishment. He did get a budget done. It wasn't completed entirely until pretty late in the year. December was when all the code bills passed, but it did include increases for education funding. That's been a huge focus for members of the legislature, everyone in Harrisburg, just because there was a court decision that ruled that Pennsylvania's system for funding education was inequitable, unconstitutionally so. And so that's been on top of mind. I think another thing for Shapiro that was, really big was, again, getting that education funding in there. And then as we look to next year, this coming budget address that we're expecting next week, I think education's, again, going to be huge focus for the administration. He's said he wants to restructure how PASHE, the state system of higher education, is overseen. He has some economic development proposals that have come out already. He has a big transit funding proposal that has been a huge priority, especially in and around Philadelphia. So those are some of the things we're watching.
Kim, what are you hearing in anticipation of next Tuesday's budget address?
Well, like Katie said, I think, there's going to be a big focus on transportation funding. There's going to be a big focus on his plan to restructure state higher education. I think the question, though, is, these are very big swings, right? Very big proposals. That the kind of thing that Shapiro is becoming sort of known for, doing a big announcement. The question is going to be what kind of cooperation he gets. Of course, we've got a divided legislature still, at least until the special election determines the balance of the House. So these are very big swings, and they make, certainly burnish Shapiro's record as someone who tries to do big things. I won't use the phrase he typically uses on TV, but I think it sounds really great, and it sounds really like things moving forward. But I think there's going to be certainly pushback from Republicans in the state Senate, if not, elsewhere, because these are some of these things have, the questions are about where the funding's going to come from, especially for the education initiatives. Are they going to take money away from other things in the budget to try and fund some of the things he wants to do? So I think very big swings. There's going to be a lot of ambitious, proposals in next week's budget address. But I think, it's going to be important for us to keep an eye on how these move through the legislature when it finally reconvenes. So I think a lot of it is still to be determined, despite kind of some of the exciting headlines we've been able to produce out of this stuff.
Todd, you write about southeastern Pennsylvania. Are there any particular areas of concern or interest for that region of the state in this year's budget?
I just think that, look, if the budget is able to be worked out such that it doesn't require a tax increase or something like that, that's great. But I think what's going on in what I'm seeing in Southeast is that a lot of governments, local governments, counties and municipalities, they're starting to enact tax increases now that ARPA funding has ended, and they're also enacting tax increases because of inflationary pressures. And really those inflationary pressures aren't like, it's not as though the cost of my copier paper went up. The inflationary pressures are really in the labor market, right? I mean, companies have raised wages. A lot of companies have raised wages, but a lot of counties and municipalities are needing to raise taxes to try to keep their workforce paid in line with market forces. Like we wrote, I'll just mention this very quickly, and this will be my last point on this issue, but we wrote a few months ago about just looking at Upper Darby, how Upper Darby is looking at starting an earned income tax credit or an earned income tax for the first time. The school district is looking at a bond issue, and Delaware County just increased its taxes. So 3 of the 4 governments that someone interfaces with, if they live in Upper Darby, have all just raised taxes. And so I think those are the kinds of things that individual legislators are keeping in mind as they're working through a budget like this. as their constituents are being squeezed from all other different governments, not the state government.
Now, a moment ago, Katie referenced the Commonwealth Court decision saying that Pennsylvania public schools are underfunded. The Basic Education Commission has also issued a report not long ago calling for additional funding. Kim, I'd like to come to you. How do you see this playing out in what the governor proposes for public school funding?
Well, I think, there's even the final report after the listening sessions that went on, over the past year, there were two reports. There was sort of the final report and then the also alternate final report. So I don't think there's a ton of consensus. I think, everyone agrees something has to be done. I think education advocates are pushing really, really hard, to make this issue stay top of mind and push the governor and push the legislature to, act and do something about this. As Katie said, that the funding system is found to be unconstitutional. So, something must be done, but there still really doesn't seem to be consensus on, exactly what that's going to look like. And I think that's going to be a situation where there's going to be compromises. There's probably going to be concessions on both sides. But I think at the moment, it's still sort of, to be determined that there's just not a lot of consensus on the best way to move forward. And I think, as Todd rightly says, if you're talking about things like tax increases, that's going to put the brakes on pretty much any proposal before it moves forward. So I think even the report that came out in the recommendations in it, still are, sort of lacking in some of the details, I think, they would need to become, to get more consensus and to get the legislature really behind it in a meaningful, bipartisan way.
Katie, what might some of these changes mean for charter schools?
Yeah, that's one of the things we looked at. Charter oversight and funding has been a huge topic for the legislature for a decade, more than a decade. We have a pretty old law that governs how they're funded and how they're overseen. And it has changed a lot, especially since the pandemic, as cyber charter schools have risen. Enrollment has really ballooned in those schools. So the question has become, is now there's some sort of will to look at that law, to actually open it up and make some changes. And a lot of lawmakers I've spoken to do think that because they simply have to make some changes to the overall education funding picture, that charter schools will be part of that. So I've talked to a lot of people. There is some consensus about issues to do with charter schools. One of the things is, since they're going to be on the hook for additional funding anyway, putting back in a line item for basically reimbursements to public schools for what's known as stranded costs that they can't really make up when a child leaves the school district to go to a charter school. Just real quickly, the way that charter schools are funded in Pennsylvania, the charter directly basically bills the school district. The school district pays for tuition for any given student. And it's based on how much the district pays for its own students. But when that happens and they're on the hook for that tuition, school districts say, and studies have borne this out, that the cost savings from a child leaving, they don't cover the tuition that they have to pay. So that's the big issue. And there is just kind of a general understanding that this is the case among Republicans and Democrats. And so there's support for this state line item that puts money back into school districts, an additional appropriation. But it's really because they just know that they're going to have to increase funding anyway. And so the big question becomes, are there going to be other changes to the way charters are funded? And not to get too granular, because it is complicated, but one of the things that I've noticed is that any changes might be limited to cyber charters. This is for a lot of reasons. Brick and mortar charter schools tend to be a little bit older. They're run by people who have a little bit more political clout. And cyber charters have proliferated. They're all across the state. People are starting to experience them where they didn't exist before. So there is more political will to change governance over cyber charters than brick and mortar charters. So that's just something to watch for. But, this is part of a really big conversation about education and how it's funded and what other changes are going to get shoehorned into any plan that happens. So we could talk about school vouchers, a real priority for the GOP. We could talk about property tax reform. That's something that Republicans really want to bring into this conversation. If there's going to be any tax increase, I think it has to include property tax reform. And that's what a lot of Republicans have told me. So, those are some of the factors we're looking at. They're really not close to a plan at this point.
The governor had also teased this week his higher education plan to make it more affordable for some Pennsylvania families. What should our viewers know about this?
Yeah. So one big thing, and then I'll kick it over to the others because I know everyone's been looking at this. Pennsylvania doesn't spend very much on higher education. I think we are the second lowest to New Hampshire in the country, and that's been kind of a growing state of affairs for a while. So Shapiro has pitched a change that would put the PASHE schools, there's 10 PASHE schools, under the same governance structure as the 15 community colleges that get public funding in Pennsylvania. And that would really just be like an administrative change. That's not a funding change. And I think we're going to have to wait for his budget address to really see like all of the funding details. We don't have those yet, and those are going to be very important. But the other big change has to do with the state-related schools. Pennsylvania's higher education system is like complicated. There's all these different categories of schools, but the state-related get state funding, but they also are overseen separately, and that's Penn State, Temple, Lincoln, and Pitt. And they have to get a 2/3 majority of the legislature to vote for any state appropriations that go to them. That becomes a really big political hurdle every year, or it has in recent years. And so that would also be changed under this proposal. So it would kind of ease that political process. But, again, we're missing a lot of details on this.
Kim, I'd like to shoot back to you for a moment. You wrote about the governor's 10-year economic development plan. What's involved in that?
Yeah, so this is something the governor has talked about for a while, right? That he's sort of signaled that this is coming for a while. And, a lot of it is sort of new initiatives that he wants to see. Basically, what his argument is, we haven't had a strategy for, economic development. We lose a lot of opportunities to Ohio and to New York because they have this sort of strategy in place. And so, there's a lot in this plan. It's meant to be a 10-year plan. A lot of it is sort of based on a federal sort of model, which would have, it's a little bit complicated, but essentially require local municipalities and organizations locally to work together kind of, cohesively to help revitalize a specific area. So that's a big area of focus. Another one is going to be, a big part of the governor's push has been to try and retain talent, right? So keep college graduates from Pennsylvania schools here in Pennsylvania, make sure there's job opportunities. That's a big portion of it as well. I think it's another one of those things that, has a lot of good, interesting sounding ideas within it. And I think what's going to be the most interesting to watch is, again, I hate to keep coming back to this, but how these will be funded and whether they're going to get buy-in from the legislature to fund some of these initiatives. Now, they are kind of intertwined with each other, some of these programs. So, it's almost like a Jenga game where you pull one piece out and it kind of affects the rest of the blocks. So I think this is something that Shapiro has really pushed, I think since the very beginning of his administration, at least for the past several months, that we need to have a cohesive, coherent plan for economic development, not just, on the sort of local level, which is what tends to happen in Pennsylvania, but a strategy statewide so that everything is sort of working together to further our, infrastructure, to make sure that we have job training and job opportunities and that businesses have resources available to them. So they want to participate in some of these state programs. People can be trained on, how to, be part of economic development initiatives. So it's very big, another very big swing. I think it's going to be again, interesting to see how it sort of moves through and what pieces of it might be approved, what pieces of it might, be sort of backburnered. But it's another part of this budget proposal next week that I think, the governor has been talking about for a while and has been a priority for him for quite some time. So.
The governor also unveiled his plan to provide $288 million for the state transit systems. Todd, what would this mean for southeastern Pennsylvania, particularly SEPTA?
Well, it would mean a lot for obviously Philly residents who, their complaints about SEPTA, are they never stop, right? So that would be a big piece of the pie. But I've got to sort of tie in the long-term plan with education funding for just a second, specifically how it relates to Southeast, which, not just where I cover, but we're talking about, where the governor's from. And it's worth remembering that the governor has significant Republican support there. And I think a lot, the Republicans that I talk to in Southeast Pennsylvania, I still think they feel very burned by what happened with the Lifeline scholarships thing last year, and that what happens, how that's introduced, if it's introduced at all this year, like that really, I love the Jenga analogy. That's a Jenga block that's just its own block, right? And because there are so many hopes, and you could horse trade on that single issue alone. And especially the Republicans that are they may not say it outwardly, but but in closed doors that okay, this is a governor we can work with. I think that they are willing to work with him in a lot of ways, but that still is a key issue to them that they've got to get at some point. And it doesn't seem to me that it's logical at all to say, well, now we'll get to it in year 3. It's got to be year 2, if you ask me.
Many of the state's transit systems are based in the more populated regions of the state. So does that make this a tough sell for lawmakers representing more rural regions?
I think so. I mean, it's always that. You hear that all the time, no matter where you live, sort of anywhere on the East Coast, right? Even if you were in D.C., you still have Virginia residents or rural Marylanders complaining about that. I think it is because it's largely an urban benefit, but that's still not to say that the more rural parts of, like, say, Bucks County doesn't benefit from that. They absolutely do, and there's acknowledgement of that.
Yeah, I would also just add, Philadelphia's SEPTA system is the biggest in the state. Pittsburgh's transit system is also large. Those get like the lion's share of funding. But again, it's just because of size. This is money for transit systems across the state. We had a story today this week from our reporter, Steve Caruso. And he had made the point, this is transit systems in Erie, Allentown, bus system in Harrisburg. So it is all over the place, and it does affect lawmakers from all parts of the state in both parties. It's transportation for elderly people who need busing to like doctor's appointments and things. So there's a lot of categories of transit that's affected. One thing I'll just kind of point as, a political element of all of this. As everyone's been pointing out, horse trading is big. There are different issues that get rolled in together. One of the ones that Republicans have brought up with transit recently is crime and public safety. And this is really explicitly tied, and they've said this, to Larry Krasner, Philadelphia's DA. He's a progressive DA. Republicans in the House, when they controlled it, tried to impeach him, or did successfully vote to impeach him, and the Senate didn't complete that process a couple of years ago. In the budget that just passed, Shapiro agreed to this. There was a bill that was separate but rolled in with everything else that took some authority away, or tries to take some authority away from Krasner when it comes to prosecuting crimes on transit. And he's challenging that in court. But that's another big and sort of politically messy component of this debate over transit that Republicans really, again, they control the Senate. They want to make this part of the issue.
Yeah, and I think they explicitly have made it part of the issue. Joe Pittman, who's the Senate Majority Leader, who represents Indiana County, he made the point that supporting a request for an increase in funding to SEPTA was kind of, I think the challenging argument to make was what he said, and specifically referenced Republicans' pushback against Krasner, and they're sort of holding him responsible for crime in Philadelphia and, by extension, crime on SEPTA. So I think that's absolutely right, that this is, again, it's this game of Jenga, right? Everything's sort of intertwined. One issue touches another. And I think Republicans may push back, by, identifying SEPTA as a, sort of the primary receiver of funds, because obviously it's the largest transit system. That is sort of an issue that Republicans may question or push back on, really specifically with regards to their complaints about crime in Philadelphia and how they kind of relate it really specifically to Larry Krasner.
I'd like to shift our focus for a moment to a state Supreme Court decision that came out this week. They basically opened the door for a case to move forward questioning whether or not taxpayer dollars can be used to fund abortions. Kim, can you explain a little bit about what happened this week?
I would love to explain a little bit about what happened this week, but I think a lot of people are still trying to figure out exactly what happened this week. This is a very complicated decision, and I think that's why initially you didn't see a lot of people coming out in support or against it, because while it does overturn this decision that upheld the constitutionality of the Pennsylvania Abortion Control Act, which banned Medicaid-funded abortions except in cases of rape or incest, it's not a universally now this is a done deal. This is basically opens up the way, clears the way for a lawsuit by abortion providers on behalf of patients who challenge the Commonwealth ban on using tax dollars to pay for the procedure. So it's partially moving this ball forward a bit. I think this is a case that's been in front of this court for quite some time. It was a very big focus of the election in November of Dan McCaffrey to the vacant seat on the court. It, as a, abortion rights and reproductive rights advocates were saying, we need to shore up the Democratic majority, and this is a way to do it. So this is a case that's been very closely watched. And I almost think that the court didn't do a really great job of kind of explaining what was next. Like, the decision is a little bit dense to understand, but basically the majority of the court said the Medicaid ban is sex-based discrimination, which is presumptively unconstitutional under the state's Equal Right Amendment. So this is definitely going to be, this is sort of the first part of, what is going to be a process. It's up to sort of now these reproductive rights organizations and healthcare providers to decide what's next. This is going to be, back to the Commonwealth Court. So it's not a done deal. It's certainly not something that's, this is finished and now we're going to move on from. But I think it's a first step toward removing the state's ban eventually on using Medicaid funding to pay for abortion. So I think it's step one. It's certainly not the definitive ruling by any means.
Katie, you'd written about the status of abortions and the legality of it in Pennsylvania. Can you explain not only where we are currently legally, but also why are there legislative attempts to try to include this in the state's constitution as well?
Sure, yeah. So Pennsylvania has abortion. It is legal up to 24 weeks gestation. And there are some exceptions. You can have an abortion later if there's a really significant health issue at play. But there are a lot of restrictions. So as Kim was saying, Medicaid cannot pay for an abortion except in cases of rape or incest or the life of the mother's at stake. Same goes for insurance purchased on the exchange in Pennsylvania. Same goes for if you are a state employee with publicly funded insurance. That also is, again, another restriction. And so those are really significant restrictions. Other restrictions that we have include a 24-hour waiting period before you can have an abortion. If a child, a minor, wants to get an abortion, they have to get approval from a parent or guardian, or they have to get a court order to go around that requirement. So again, there's a long list of restrictions that organizations like Planned Parenthood have tried to move against, especially the insurance ones. Those are the really big ones because, again, not everyone can afford to pay out of pocket for this stuff. So that's kind of where we stand right now. I mean, a couple of years ago, Republicans in the legislature tried to pass and began passing, it could still pass, a constitutional amendment that would have added language to the state constitution that would have basically said there is no constitutional right to an abortion in Pennsylvania. That was in anticipation of this lawsuit and other lawsuits like it. It would have essentially tied judges' hands. They wouldn't be able to say the Constitution already protects the right to an abortion based on the Equal Rights Amendment or any other part of the Constitution. It would have just made it explicit. It's not in there. It also could have had an impact on the kind of legislation that got passed. If an abortion restricting law got passed and was challenged, that constitutional amendment would have kind of prevented those challenges of it. So that's one of the things that was in play really recently, 2022. Again, it hasn't been reintroduced this session. So again, they still have time. They could do it. It passed both chambers last time. But a couple things have changed since then. Roe v. Wade was overturned, and Doug Mastriano, who kind of had a very strong anti-abortion position, very definitively lost the gubernatorial race. That was significant. Also, Republicans lost the state house. That was also significant. A lot of those things were seen. I mean, Mastriano, there are a lot of factors, but they were seen as being related to the fact that abortion was now a live issue. Roe v. Wade was gone. So I think that when you're looking at what Republicans are willing to do on this now legislatively, there is less political will to pass something like this these days. I talked to Republicans when I was writing that story. They said there's no real plan to bring that amendment back. That said, again, there's plenty of room for movement on this. Democrats are pushing really hard to, in a legislative way, create some new avenues to beat back some of those restrictions. So the insurance stuff, that's like a big one. We'll have to wait and see. Again, there's still a divided legislature with divided positions over this. But yeah, there's been a lot of movement on this in Pennsylvania.
I'd like to shift our focus just a little bit. Todd, you've been writing a lot about the George W. Hill Correctional Facility in Delaware County and how they've seen 11 inmate deaths in roughly about 2 years since management had shifted. Can you explain what's been happening down there?
Sure. So that facility was privately run for about 30 years, and it was the last privately run jail, or it's a combination jail and prison, as you said, in Delaware County. The management, there was a transition period, but the county installed its own warden in February of 22, and then the official transition happened right at the 1st of April of that year. And so if you're looking at when the new warden started, you're right, there have been 11 deaths since then. 3 suicides, a 4th that I'm trying to confirm. But there have been others that have just been disturbing in different ways. For example, there was a black man, Mustafa Jackson. They said he was a delayed homicide. He had been shot years earlier. It left him a paraplegic, and so he had to catheterize a lot. He got an infection, and he ended up getting urosepsis. The question for us is, urosepsis usually doesn't set on within an hour or two. It takes a couple of days. It's noticeable for days, and we're wondering about the kind of care he got. A story that I'll publish later today, there was a young man, Andrew Little, who committed suicide in that facility in 2022. The cell door is supposed to operate from a control room, and it didn't open. And so a guard had to run back to the control room to get keys and physically run back. And my sources tell me that adds at least 2 minutes to the whole process. And here you're trying to save someone who's dying in their cell. Those are just a couple of examples of some of the disturbing details that we've got, that using documents through the right to know law and through some sources who, because of their intimate knowledge of the prison, are able to sort of read through some of the documents that I'm getting and point me to the way.
Is there any anticipation that either facility will see some sort of repercussions as a result of the deaths, or perhaps a change in management once again, or some kind of greater oversight?
Well, I mean, I think, private management is just off the table right now. I mean, quite honestly, I don't see it coming back. But I would say that of the jail oversight board meetings that I've watched, there's really no acknowledgement of any of these issues at all. And just to give you one very quick example, I don't know how much time we've got left, but the prisoner or the correctional officers have gone to county board meetings and said our morale it's actually lower than when it was privately managed. And one of the things that they're complaining about is the management took away split shifts. And this is their ability, if they get a mandatory overtime shift, they can hand 4 of those hours off to a buddy, so that rather than having to work a 16-hour day, they only have to work a 12-hour day. I mean, a 16-hour day in a prison that's an extraordinarily demanding, it's very demanding. And so, I mean, there hasn't even been acknowledgement or even questioning from the jail oversight board to the warden of, why did you take this away, and why is this something we're not even willing to negotiate on with our correctional officers?
Unfortunately, we are out of time. So much to talk about today. Our guests have been Kim Lyons, editor with the Pennsylvania Capital Star, Todd Shepherd, chief investigative reporter with Broad and Liberty, and Katie Meyer, government editor and reporter for Spotlight PA. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Francine Schertzer. Thank you for watching.